Howdy folks, Timber Drifter here. Smoking my favorite old pipe. Well, this is my 12th day on the river. Come 111 miles as of last night. And unfortunately, my journey is concluded. Not because I want it to be, but because I've gotten poison ivy. I'm highly allergic to poison ivy. For those of you that aren't familiar with the plant, it's highly variable. I've seen it in Florida. I saw it as vines that were coming down as streamers from the treetops. I've seen it in Oklahoma and Kansas where it's a vine stalk this big around and the leaves are bigger than my hand. I've seen it where the leaves are as big as my thumbnail, as a creeping ground cover. Here that's how it is. It's a creeping ground cover and the leaves are about that big around. They're not sawtooth edges most of the time like you see in the books. They're irregular, almost lobes, usually a lobe on one side of the leaf. But poison ivy was the bane of my young existence, and it's one of the reasons I live in northern Wisconsin is because there's hardly any here. Mostly you'll find it on islands and lakes and campgrounds. However, I've come far enough south that I've hit the area where poison ivy starts to grow. And the day I made my last video, around 2 o'clock that day, I slid down a hillside right through a big patch of it and into the river. Tell that story in a minute. The effect of poison ivy is like burns. You get little blisters or big patches. My whole left bicep is just one big patch of sort of looks like eczema, and it feels like a third-degree burn. Got it behind the knees, on my wrists and forearms. It's starting to show up right here, which means my eyes could end up swelling shut. I was in and out of the hospital with it several times as a kid, and I've had many weeks, probably months, accumulation of uncomfortable time throughout my life with it, with poison ivy. And I don't want to end up in the hospital, so I've called the trip off. Maybe I can go home and use the herbs that I know work and heal myself up. But being allergic to it, it's a little different than just getting it. Most people just get a little, irritation, a few little patches. I'm allergic, so I tend to get almost full body coverage when I get it bad. So I've called the trip off. I've called my buddy to come pick me up. It's kind of a sad day, but it's alright too, because I didn't want to just do this trip for adventure, which it has been. I needed to figure some things out, work some things out in my mind. And I've talked about this before. I have a hard time getting to the place in my mind where where I can just be where I'm at and think clearly on a daily basis. It takes me getting completely out of my normal situations and getting out on the road or a long time in the woods or something like that, where that constant show that's happening in my mind slows down and I quit telling myself stories and quit trying to remember the lyrics to songs and going over things and having, rehashing conversations and having conversations that never existed just to have someone to argue with when I'm by myself. All that stuff takes a while to go away for me. And I can get to that point where I can think clearly and I can make decisions and I can just be where I'm at. And that's where I've been. It took about 5-6 days to get there. But since then, I've been one of those blissed out folks. I've just been in a great mood. Things come and go, made some decisions. For the last couple of years, I've been just kind of floating. I've been depressed a lot. Or just not caring about anything. I'd come to a point in my life where things weren't working anymore and I knew it, so I bailed. And I hadn't really had any direction since then. I've had some ideas, but not the will to follow through with them. And that's what I was hoping to find on this trip. And I did. I have found it. I've made those decisions. And I know what I want to do. I know what direction to go. Yeah, the story of how I fell into a patch of poison ivy and slid down a hill into the river. So I'd come through several rapids that day after portaging across the dam. And they weren't much, they were just a little fun. But the last one I'd come through had me spooked. So when I came to another set, coming around a big wide bend in the river, and I could hear the rapids. So I got fairly close and went out in the middle of the river and took a look at what I could see. And then paddled back and off to the side. And I was climbing a hill so I could get a look at the rapids and figure out how I wanted to run them, if I could run them, and if not, where I could portage. So I got out on the inside of the curve, so if I had to portage, I'd be going the least amount of distance rather than going all the way around the curve. But once I got up there, I realized there was no portage trail. The woods were very thick, full of alder and hazelbrush and blackberry bramble. There wasn't any way to portage. As I was standing there looking at the rapids, thinking, boy, I don't know how I'm going to do this, I decided to get to a higher vantage point so I could see a little bit further around. And I realized that the rapids were as far as I could see down the river. So even if I was to portage, it would be miles of portaging. Rain. Happy to be under my tarp. But while I was going up that hill, I was wearing my shoes that I wear in my canoe, which are basically just rubber slippers. Steep hill, I slid down, grasping at the hill as I was going down. Went through a patch of poison ivy and into the water. Barely missed my canoe, actually. But I came to a point where I realized that there was not going to be any portage and there was no going back. I couldn't go back up the rapids I'd already been through. No roads nearby. So I knew I was going to have to run the rapids. So I secured everything, got in the canoe and headed out. And it was a pretty wild trip. Pretty rough rapids. At one point I dropped, I don't know how far, maybe 6 feet. And filled the canoe about a third of the way up with water, which makes it very hard to keep stable and steer. But I came down this chute, and right at the bottom, water was just rolling in like this. And of course it didn't go on the covers in the front or the back of the canoe. Those shed the water. It came right in the middle, right where I was sitting, and everything got soaked but my hat. So I pulled over to this rocky area on the side. The water was still moving really fast. Dumped all the water out, made sure everything was dry, repacked my canoe and headed right back out. That's a hell of a point to get to when you know you can't go back and you can't go around and you just gotta go straight through. That's a good metaphor for life sometimes. You can't avoid things forever. You can just sit still in one spot and hope everything goes away or gets better or somebody comes to rescue you, but in the end it's all up to you. Sometimes you just gotta run the rapids.